Picture this. You're walking through the marble corridors of the most powerful palace on earth in the year 1540. The scent of jasmine and rosewater fills the air, mixing with something darker, fear. Your silk saw you're escorted deeper into apers, make no sound against the polished floors, as world that few outsiders have ever seen and lived to describe. The guards flanking you are massive, silent men whose eyes reveal nothing, but their presence tells you everything you need to know about where you're headed. You pass through 7 locked doors, each one sealing you further from the outside world, each one bringing you closer to the most secretive and dangerous place in the Ottoman Empire. The walls around you are adorned with precious gems and intricate calligraphy, but you notice something else. Scratches in the marble, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had clawed desperately at the stone. The final door opens with a heavy groan, and you step into a realm where beauty and terror dance together in ways that will haunt your dreams forever. Welcome to the Imperial Harem, a place where love could mean death, where a single whispered word might save a life or end it in history, and where the most powerful women orchestrated schemes so twisted that they make modern political intrigue look like children's games. Before diving into these forbidden secrets that the Ottoman Empire tried desperately to hide from the world, if you enjoy uncovering the dark truths behind history's most mysterious institutions, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we corners of the globe connect or exploring these hidden stories together from different across centuries by our shared fascination with the shadows behind imperial grandeur. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of royal excess or palace intrigue. This is the story of how absolute power corrupted absolutely, how mothers murdered their own stepchildren for political gain, and how a system designed to protect the dynasty became its greatest threat. The Ottoman harem wasn't the sensual paradise that Hollywood movies have portrayed. It was a battlefield where survival required intelligence, ruthlessness, and the willingness to destroy anyone who stood between you and power. Let's begin with the woman who would rewrite the rules of this deadly game forever. Her name was Hurrem Sultan, though history knows her better as Roxolana, and she represents both the pinnacle of female power in the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of an era so blood-soaked that it would be remembered as the Sultanate of Women. But Roxolana wasn't born to power. She was born to slavery, captured from her homeland in what is now Ukraine. Probably when she was around 15 years old, she arrived at the imperial palace as human cargo, one of countless young women torn from their families to serve the empire's insatiable appetite for fresh beauty. The slave markets that fed the harem were brutal enterprises, but what happened after purchase was far worse than anything the victims could have imagined. The selection process was methodical and dehumanizing. Palace officials examined the girls like livestock, checking their teeth, testing their skin for blemishes, evaluating their potential for beauty as they matured. Those deemed suitable were scrubbed, clothed in simple garments, and assigned numbers rather than names. Their old identities were stripped away as systematically as their clothing, replaced with new personas designed to serve the Sultan's pleasure and the empire's political needs. Roxolana's transformation from Ukrainian slave to Ottoman empress represents one of the most remarkable rises to power in human history, but it came at a cost measured in blood and broken lives. The harem system that would terrify modern observers, absolute submission navigated and ultimately dominated, was built on principles to male authority, deadly competition between women, and the understanding that survival meant destroying your rivals before they destroyed you. The palace complex where she would spend the rest of her life was a city within a city, housing thousands of people in etude. The imperial harem occupy a carefully orchestrated hierarchy of power and served its own section of this massive complex, surrounded by walls within walls, guarded by eunuchs who had been mutilated to ensure they could never pose a threat to the Sultan's exclusive claim on his women. These eunuchs were captured as children from Christianed, another layer of the system's cruelty. Most families subjected to castration procedures that killed more than half of them, and then trained to serve as guardians of women they could never possess. Their survival depended on absolute loyalty to a system that had destroyed their manhood, creating enforcers who understood that their own fate was tied to maintaining the very institution that had brutalized them. Within the harem's walls, hundreds of women lived in a world where every conversation could be a trap every friendship a potential betrayal, and every moment of favor sultan a target painted on their backs. The hierarchy was rigid and merciless. At the top sat the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, whose word was law among the women. Below her were the sultan's official wives, then his favored concubines, then the general population of slave girls who might catch, and finally the servants his eye, who maintained this elaborate prison. But calling it a prison doesn't capture the psychological complexity of the harem system. These women weren't just captives, they were participants in their own oppression, competitors in a game where the stakes were life and death, and the rules changed according to the whims of men who saw them as beautiful objects rather than human beings. The daily routine of harem life was designed to break down individual identity and replace it with complete devotion to the sultan and the imperial system. The women woke before dawn for prayers they had been forced to learn in a religion that wasn't their own. They spent hours in elaborate grooming rituals, not for their own pleasure, but to maintain their value as imperial property. They studied Turkish, Arabic, and Persian, not to expand their minds, but to better serve their masters. They learned music, dance, and poetry, not as art forms, but as tools of seduction. Most heartbreaking of all, they were taught to compete against each other for scraps of attention from a man who viewed them as interchangeable ornaments. Friendships were dangerous as ally, because today might become tomorrow's rival for the sultan's favor. Trust was a luxury that could prove fatal when the sultan's interest shifted to a younger, more beautiful face. The architecture itself reinforced their imprisonment. Windows were placed the women from seeing the outside world awed high and barred, preventing being seen by unauthorized eyes. Corridors were designed as mazes, making escape nearly impossible even if someone managed to evade the guards. The beautiful gardens they were allowed to walk in could also be a cage, ending them that paradise was surrounded by walls topped with sharp spikes. Yet within this system of oppression, some women managed to accumulate extraordinary power. The successful ones learned to navigate the deadly currents of gathering intelligence and positioning harem politics, building networks of allies, arose. They understood themselves to strike when opportunity that in were property, information, a world where women currency that truly was the only mattered. Roxolana mastered these skills better her. She learned after than anyone before, awed to read the sultan's moods, anticipate his desires, and present herself as than merely beautiful. She understood that beauty, indispensable rather she used, her man-women used their bodies. But fades, but intelligence endures, and as ruthlessly as other, her rise to power required sacrifices that reveal the true horror of the harem system. To become the sultan's favorite, she had to destroy other women who stood in her way. To securate the deaths of rivals her children's futures, she had to orchestrate to participate in a system that treats sons. To maintain her position, she had human beings as expendable resources glory. The transformation in the pursuit of captured slave girls into willing participants in their own oppression represents examples of one of history's most sophisticated manipulation. The palace didn't just imprison bodies, it captured souls, turning victims into accomplices and survivors into perpetrators of the same cruelties they had once endured. And within the harem walls, when in the rituals surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, this psychological transformation was most visible. When a concubine became pregnant with the sultan's child, she entered an entirely new level of the deadly game. Pregnancy meant potential power, but it also meant becoming a target for every other woman who dreamed of seeing her own son on the throne. The pregnant concubines were moved to special quarters where they were supposedly protected and pampered, but in reality, they lived in constant fear of poison, mysterious accidents, or sudden illnesses that would end both their lives and their unborn children's futures. Palace physicians were often bribed or threatened to ensure certain outcomes, and the mortality rate among pregnant concubines was suspiciously high compared to women outside the palace walls. But surviving childbirth was only the beginning of a mother's nightmare. The moment a son was born to any concubine, every other woman in the harem understood that this child represented a potential threat to their own children's survival. The Ottoman succession system was built on bloodshed, and mothers learned to see other women's babies not as innocent children, but as future executioners of their own sons. This is where the true genius of the harem's psychological manipulation becomes clear. The system turned maternal love, the most basic and powerful human instinct, into a weapon of destruction. Mothers didn't just compete for their children's advancement. They plotted for other children's deaths. They smiled at rival mothers while secretly arranging for their sons to meet tragic accidents. They cooed over other women's babies while calculating the best methods to eliminate future competition. The palace employed specialists in these deadly arts, women who had perfected the use of slow-acting poisons that mimicked natural illnesses, who knew exactly how much pressure to apply to an infant's throat to make death look like sudden illness, who could arrange for a child to drown in a bath while appearing to be a devoted caretaker attempting rescue. These weren't monsters born evil. They were mothers driven to monstrous acts by a system that made their children's survival dependent on other children's deaths. The psychological toll on these women was devastating and carefully documented by the few observers who managed to glimpse behind the harem's curtain. European ambassadors occasionally reported seeing concubines who had clearly lost their minds, women who talked to imaginary children, who screamed in languages they claimed to have forgotten, who alternated between periods of catatonic silence and violent outbursts that required physical restraint. But perhaps most disturbing were the women who appeared completely normal, who had adapted so thoroughly to the system that they seemed to genuinely enjoy the deadly competition. These were the ones who had learned to find pleasure in their rivals' pain, who celebrated other women's tragedies as their own victories, who had become so completely corrupted by the harem's twisted values that they could no longer remember what normal human relationships felt when they were finally open to like. The palace archives, historians centuries later, revealed the true scope of the carnage hidden behind the harem's beautiful facade. Records show that during particularly intense periods of succession crisis, infant mortality rates within the palace reached levels that were statistically impossible to explain through natural causes. Entire family lines would be wiped out within months, leaving only the children of the most ruthless mothers to carry on the imperial bloodline. One particularly chilling document describes what happened during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, known to history as Ibrahim the Mad, whose psychological instability turned the already dangerous harem into a charnel house. Ibrahim's paranoia and cruelty created an atmosphere where women were executed not just for political reasons, but for failing to laugh at his jokes, for wearing colours he suddenly decided he hated, or simply because their faces reminded him of people who had displeased him in the past. The records describe scenes that read like something from the darkest horror stories. Women forced to watch their children tortured as punishment for imagined slights. Mothers compelled to participate in the execution of their own daughters to prove their loyalty to the Sultan. Concubines driven to suicide rather than face another day in Ibrahim's increasingly deranged court. But even Ibrahim's reign of terror pales in comparison to the systematic cruelty that characterized the harem's normal operations. The everyday reality for most women was a grinding psychological warfare that destroyed souls more efficiently than any physical torture could have managed. They lived in constant fear, not just of death, but of betrayal by the people closest to them. Roommates who might poison their food for a chance at advancement. Servants who reported their private conversations to the Sultan's spies. Even their own children who learned to manipulate their mother's love for political advantage. The education system within the harem was designed to perpetuate this cycle of destruction. Young girls were taught from their earliest years that other women were enemies, that trust was weakness, that love was a luxury they couldn't afford. They learned to read faces for signs of deception, to detect poison in their food, to sleep lightly and always with weapons within reach. These weren't skills any child should have needed, but they were essential for survival in the harem's toxic environment. The most successful women in this system were those who managed to completely suppress their natural human empathy and replace it with cold calculation. They learned to comfort grieving mothers while secretly planning their next child's death, to offer friendship while gathering intelligence for future betrayals, to display maternal affection while teaching their own children that love was conditional on their ability to eliminate competition. The transformation was so complete that when some of these women were eventually freed from the harem through marriage or political changes, they found themselves unable to function in normal society. They had become so adapted to the harem's twisted rules that concepts like genuine friendship, unconditional love, or simple human kindness seemed foreign and threatening. Many former harem women spent their remaining years in isolation, unable to trust anyone and incapable of forming the basic human connections that make life meaningful. The ripple effects of this psychological destruction extended far beyond the palace walls, affecting the entire structure of Ottoman society for generations. The sons who survived this brutal system and eventually ascended to power carried with them the psychological scars of their harem upbringing, creating a cascade of dysfunction that would plague the empire for centuries. These future sultans had learned from childhood that women were simultaneously objects to be possessed and threats to be neutralized, that love was a weakness that could be exploited, and that trust was a luxury that could prove fatal. When these psychologically damaged men took the throne, they brought the harem's toxic dynamics into their governance of the entire empire. They approached diplomacy like harem intrigue, seeing every negotiation as a zero-sum game where survival required the complete destruction of opponents. They treated their subjects like concubines, valuable property to be used and discarded at will. Most devastatingly, they perpetuated the same cycle of abuse that had shaped them, ensuring that each new generation of Ottoman rulers would be even more damaged than the last. The palace eunuchs who supervised this system of destruction represented perhaps its most tragic victims and its most efficient enforcers. These men had been stolen as children from Christian families across the empire's vast territories, subjected to castration procedures that killed the majority of candidates, and then trained to become the perfect guardians of women they could never possess. Their survival depended on maintaining a system that had destroyed their manhood and any possibility of normal human relationships. The psychological conditioning of these eunuchs was masterful in its cruelty. They were taught to find their identity, not in their own humanity, but in their absolute service to the imperial system. They competed ruthlessly among themselves for positions of authority within the harem hierarchy, understanding that power over women was the only form of masculine identity available to them. The most successful eunuchs became legendary for their ability to detect and crush any sign of rebellion among the women under their control. But the eunuchs also served another crucial function. They were the harem's memory keepers, the ones who preserved and passed down the techniques of psychological manipulation that made the system so effective. They taught new arrivals the unwritten rules of survival, the subtle signs that indicated when someone had fallen from favor, the methods for gathering and trading the intelligence that served as the harem's primary currency. They understood better than anyone that knowledge was power, and they hoarded information like misers hoarded gold. The most successful eunuchs developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional undercurrents that flowed through the harem's corridors. They could predict which women would attempt suicide before the women themselves recognized their despair. They knew which rivalries would explode into violence and which alliances would crumble under pressure. They understood the delicate balance of terror and hope that kept hundreds of women compliant, despite having every reason to rebel. The daily routines these eunuchs orchestrated were carefully designed to maintain this psychological control. They scheduled the women's activities to minimize opportunities for genuine bonding, while maximizing chances for petty conflicts that would prevent unified resistance. They rotated room assignments to ensure that no lasting friendships could develop. They controlled access to information from the outside world, feeding the women carefully selected news designed to reinforce their dependence on the palace system. The marble corridors that once echoed with the whispered conspiracies and muffled screams of the imperial harem still stand today, transformed into a museum where tourists admire the architectural beauty while remaining blissfully unaware of the psychological horrors that unfolded within these very walls. The Ottoman Empire's most carefully guarded secret wasn't military strategy or diplomatic cunning. It was a system so perfectly designed to destroy the human spirit that it turned mothers into murderers and love into a weapon of mass destruction. These weren't just stories of ancient cruelty. They're reminders that the capacity for systematic dehumanization exists in every era, hidden behind beautiful facades and justified by those who benefit from others' suffering. The women who died in those chambers deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to imperial glory, but as human beings whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of absolute power.